Elden Ring is finally upon us, and what a reception it's received. The game is heralded as one of the best games of all time, and for good reason. Combat is excellent, enemies and bosses are as intimidating and challenging as always, and the Soulsborne genre finally went open world, to fantastic results. Initially, I had my doubts when it was announced that Elden Ring would be in this format. Yet, From Software has somehow crafted an open world that does not feel like an open world at all. I hardly see any reused assets or tons of repetitive objectives or a checklist of markers scattered all over the map. Everything that is in the world feels like it's been placed there with a purpose, from enemies to hidden items and gear. Now, one of the first things that we lovely humans enjoy doing is forming a comparison between things to form a familiar connection. For example, what does this meat that I've never tasted before, taste like? Oh, it tastes like chicken. It is human nature to compare for a better understanding of what we don't know or just don't fully understand. So, Elden Ring's open world design is being compared to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and the design choices its developers took to craft that excellent open world. So how do these comparisons stack? Well, let's do what humans do by nature, and compare and contrast.
TGR.
Earlier in the week, I posted a question on our Discord, and I published a community post asking our subscribers to tell us what 3 aspects of their design makes a great open world game. After a few days, we got a few different answers, and they looked something like this. I took this information and broke it down into 6 different categories based on the most common answers. These answers were exploration, freedom, world building or story lore, unique locations, good visuals, atmosphere, and a payoff to the actions and or exploration. I'll reveal how many times each of these was mentioned after the comparison, so we can then see which of these criteria both titles achieved either greatly or poorly. Speaking of the comparison, this is how that will go. I will choose a random location on the map for both games. I will then traverse the game's world in any given direction for about 10 to 15 minutes, noting every time that I find something that is either interesting to me or catches my eye. This could be an NPC, a landmark, or a far-off but interesting-looking location, and then we'll see what happens. Afterwards, I'll compare both instances from both games and see what they do similarly and differently. This experiment and semi-analysis isn't meant to be incredibly accurate or anything of the sort, but rather a fun look at how 2 of the best games in the subgenre that is open world achieved the level of quality they so masterfully presented. Let's start by revisiting 2017's Breath of the Wild. A game that I haven't booted up since 2018, when I played the DLC, which is fantastic and I highly recommend anyone to buy. After a little fumbling around and getting used to the controls, I started the experiment, teleporting to Faron and seeing where the winds would take me. Immediately, I ran into an issue that I had forgotten about for quite some time. Thunderstorms damage you if you have any metal equipment. It took me by surprise, but it also reminded me of how amazing the systems in Breath of the Wild are, especially when they work in conjunction with one another. Anyway, moving on, I begin to explore. I battle some enemies and climb a bit before eventually getting on the Hyrule Ducati, and notice an NPC pulling a donkey, which I believe is a merchant if I recall correctly. Then immediately after, I run into Cass. I speak to the Birdman with the organ, and he gives us a quest that I never got around to completing, so I go to the area that he describes. Seems like it's a shrine hunt, which I unfortunately do not find. I do, however, run into a bokoblin encampment and fight off some enemies before attempting to find said shrine. After a couple of minutes of running and climbing around, I decided it's been long enough in this area and moved over to a more centralized and open area in central Hyrule. There, I get on the bike and start roaming around, which then Link gets some boulders thrown at him. I explored the area where they came from, and there wasn't anything but a couple of slimes, so I assumed the enemies were gone, and I get back on the bike and head to these 2 peaks that are in the distance. On the way, I notice an NPC and start talking to them. He gives Link some insight into the area, and guardians may be running around. And then I continue on my path, avoiding enemies and heading to those peaks. I ran into an area with some giant logs and some boulders that were pushed down. At the top, there was a Korok puzzle that I had already solved, so time to just continue. Eventually, I arrive at the base of the mountains, and while there, I realized that my arbitrary 10 to 15 minute limit to my open exploration was coming to an end. I really want to mention that if that wasn't the case, I would have undoubtedly climbed or attempted to climb those twin peaks. The possibilities of what could be near or on the top were too alluring. Regardless though, I did continue until I reached the horse stable on the other side and noticed that there was a Korok puzzle on top of that stable that I never completed before, so I did. All in all, the exploration and world design of Breath of the Wild are really top notch, even 5 years later. So much so that it almost feels like the world of Hyrule is inviting the player to get lost and seek the next interesting place of interest. Now we move on to Elden Ring. From the moment that you walk into the fields of Limgrave, you can already see so many points of interest, similar to the Great Plateau in Breath of the Wild. As you start your journey, most players are led forward and find themselves at the Church of LA. Now, since this is supposed to be a randomized trial where I kind of wanted to go wherever my sense of wonder would lead me, I spoke to the merchant and noticed that there was a speak option that seemed tied to a side quest. He gives me the finger snap gesture and sends me on my way to find a specific NPC in a relatively nearby forest, so I start heading in that direction, taking out some enemy mobs and some giants that I happened to come across. After some traveling and taking out another giant that decided to jump at me from the side of a cliff, the madman, I found one of those golden rune graveyards and picked up those lovely goodies alongside a cookbook. I continued to travel east, killed another giant, and stopped at the third church of Marika. Then after, I moved south and noticed that there was a purple item next to a giant bear that's scratching a tree. I stealthed it and picked up another cookbook. After some more time on my lovely steed Torrent, I found the ruins that the previous NPC mentioned and did the gesture I was given to summon a very tall wolf dude. Very cool. He tells me that he wants me to take down this enemy, but I had already killed it. So I traveled to the location where the fight took place, and lo and behold, Wolf Dude is there. He gives me my prize and tells me to meet a blacksmith at Raya Lucaria. And after almost 20 minutes, my session with Elden Ring ends. As we can see, from a simple side quest, there was just a lot to see and do. The world feels extremely dense and full of things to see, enemies to take down, and NPCs to discover. And what you guys saw here is just the tip of the gigantic iceberg. So now that we've looked at the footage, let's look back at the criteria you lovely viewers voted on. When it comes to unique locations, we got 2 mentions, alongside good visuals and atmosphere, which also had 2 mentions. Do these games both achieve success in these criteria? In my opinion, absolutely. Both Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring look pretty amazing, due to a stylistic choice in art design that will more than likely stand the test of time. Even more so in Breath of the Wild's case, with its hybrid cel-shaded look. Both games also have an incredibly varied landscape with many unique locations to explore. Next, we had the payoff to actions and exploration, with 3 mentions, and this one can be a bit more complicated. We know that both games are trying to be 2 relatively different things, since Elden Ring is more heavily leaning towards RPG elements, and Breath of the Wild is more of the Zelda formula being shattered. Either way though, there is a payoff to both games' exploration. In Elden Ring, you can find a variety of weapons, armor, items, mini-dungeons, and bosses, while in Breath of the Wild, you also find these things just to somewhat of a lesser degree. Regardless, they both excel and provide ample payoff to the player's exploration. With 4 mentions, world building or a good story / deep lore takes the next spot. We know From Software likes to fill their games with tons of lore, and Elden Ring was written by George R.R. Martin. But the story is not told through the most traditional means, even though in this game it is a bit easier to follow along. Just very cryptic and just not my favorite form of storytelling. In Breath of the Wild, the story was also told in a non-linear fashion, with players having to find and view optional flashbacks that provided a ton of relatively crucial backstory hidden across the world. But the current story and Link's adventure was presented relatively normally. It just lacked a lot of the weight without the aforementioned flashbacks. Personally, I wasn't a fan of this either, but I know that many players enjoyed it. Either way, they do storytelling in their own unique ways, for better or worse, but it is rather interesting and it keeps players engaged. Then finally, we have both good exploration and freedom to explore at 6 mentions each. We all know that these games just kind of throw you in there and let you explore at your own pace, and this is one of the most important aspects in what separates a fantastic open world from a mediocre one. Both games are excellent in this regard, with enough feedback from the world and plenty of freedom to tackle things in whatever way or order you want. So based on the criteria mentioned and the footage I recorded, the games are actually quite similar in how they approach open world design. I believe that a comparison between both titles isn't a negative thing either, as some articles that I've read online seem to discuss. And truly, it's a comparison that only exists because of the incomprehensible quality both games offer. When Breath of the Wild came out almost 5 years ago, my god, it was heralded as the best open world game, and now Elden Ring comes and elevates the standard that Breath of the Wild set. Game design is evolutionary, taking from the ideas that came before and ironing out the kinks to deliver a better product with each iteration. I hope that this fun experiment shows that both games truly achieve similar goals in slightly different ways. But ultimately, the decisions their respective visionary chose to implement in their design and their processes elevated what we now expect from open world games. And if I'm honest, it will be extremely difficult to play an open world game and not compare to the greatness that we have in both Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring. And there you have it, folks. That is the end of my experiment. If you made it all the way here, thank you so much for sticking it to the end. I really hope that this was fun. I hope that this brings you maybe a different view to what you may have thought of each game or why you may not have wanted them to be compared. I think that both games, like I said earlier, are excellent and they deserve all the attention they have received and will continue to receive in the years to come. Anyway, thanks so much for checking out the video. My name is Onyx, part of the Gaming Resume. If you want to check us out, check out our Discord, join our twitch.tv/the Gaming Resume subscriber base, and of course, if you want to support the channel, check out Patreon as well. And anyway, if you're new to the channel, please subscribe and hit the like button, because if you don't, we will die. Yes, we will. In Elden Ring, of course. But anyway, thanks so much for your time, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.
Hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to see more and stay up to date, subscribe, hit the little bell, and join our Discord.
If you want to support the channel, please check out our Patreon or hit the join button below. As always, thanks for your support and thanks for watching.